Right, so reports have emerged that Israel had been holding confidential discussions with South Sudan over the possible relocation of Palestinians from Gaza. Yes, they are still fixated on finding a third country to displace everyone to, as per the Trump plan for a Trump Riviera to replace the Gaza Strip, becoming the Trump Strip, I suppose. You know his name will be shoehorned in there somewhere. But this proposal has been consistently framed as voluntary migration and humanitarian relief. In reality, it is a move that international law defines as forcible transfer. It is, of course, ethnic cleansing. The Associated Press has revealed that 6 individuals familiar with the talks have confirmed their existence, noting plans for a high-level Israeli delegation to travel to Juba. One source alleged a memorandum of understanding had already been signed by Deputy Foreign Minister Sharon Haskell. South Sudan has publicly denied the reports, but history shows such denials often mask ongoing negotiations. The very fact that such talks are occurring is a consequence of Israel's broader strategy, facing mounting legal pressure and international censure over its war in Gaza. It's genocide. It is turning to vulnerable states that can be persuaded or pressured into taking on the burden of demographic engineering, dressed up as humanitarian aid. But if South Sudan is their number one potential state for relocation, it merely underlines how little they care about the Palestinian people and what becomes of them next. Right, so the AP's reporting was unusually detailed for such a sensitive subject as it happens. It noted that planning was underway for a high-level Israeli delegation to travel to Juba, and one source alleged that Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister Sharon Haskell, a potential candidate to become the next Israeli ambassador to the UK when we rid ourselves of Zippy Hotovely, whose 5-year stint is finally coming to an end imminently, had already signed a memorandum of understanding with South Sudanese counterparts. The East African press reported that although the government of South Sudan had publicly rejected the idea, there was unease within its political circles about being linked to any plan that could be seen as facilitating ethnic cleansing. Other international outlets, including the Cradle, Middle East Eye and Al Jazeera, ran similar accounts, many pointing out that this was not an isolated initiative. Earlier in the year, other reports had come out that Israel had approached several other states: Somalia, Somaliland, Libya, Sudan, Indonesia, Egypt. They've been trying very hard at this, with variations on the same relocation proposal. In July, it was reported that an Israeli minister had unveiled a plan to confine Gaza's population in a so-called humanitarian city, of course, built on the ruins of Rafah, a blueprint human rights groups denounced as a scheme for mass internment and displacement. It was, of course, a proposal for a concentration camp. So the South Sudan proposal was instantly denied by the country's foreign ministry, which said the reports were baseless and did not reflect government policy. And on the face of it, such denials might seem decisive, therefore. Yet history shows that they are a standard feature of controversial third country deals, especially in their early stages. Rwanda and Uganda both issued similar denials during Israel's 2013 to 2018 attempts to offload African asylum seekers there, even as negotiations continued behind the scenes. Albania publicly distanced itself from Italy's offshore asylum processing plan until its government was ready to announce a deal. The pattern is one of strategic denial. Avoid immediate political costs while keeping the option alive in private. There are good reasons for South Sudan to tread carefully here. To admit to participating in a plan to take in forcibly displaced Gazans would be to invite legal and diplomatic fire. It's what's put every other nation off this idea, of course. Under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, the forcible transfer or deportation of protected persons from occupied territory is prohibited regardless of their motive. There are only 2 exceptions to that: temporary evacuation for the security of civilians or imperative military reasons, and neither applies to moving civilians into another conflict-affected state with no prospect of return. Any government knowingly facilitating such a transfer risks being seen as complicit in a grave breach of the Convention, potentially amounting to a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. South Sudanese leaders could find themselves the subjects of arrest warrants if the ICC prosecutor deems that they have aided and abetted an internationally wrongful act. On the diplomatic front, such a move would almost certainly provoke condemnation from the African Union and the Arab League, alienating key partners like Sudan and Egypt. Egypt apparently had been warning South Sudan to refuse to take the Palestinians, whilst inflaming public opinion across much of Africa and the Middle East. If the denials are taken at face value, they represent a refusal to walk into that minefield. If they are, as precedent suggests they might be, a form of political insulation while talks proceed privately, then they speak to South Sudan's acute awareness of the risks involved. So the question then arises, why would Israel target South Sudan in the first place? And the answer lies in the country's unique blend of vulnerabilities and needs. Economically, South Sudan is almost entirely dependent on oil exports, which must travel through pipelines in Sudan to reach international markets. This creates a structural dependence on an often hostile neighbour, a neighbour that is currently the scene of the biggest humanitarian crisis on the planet right now, as the war between the state and the RSF militias rage on and leaves its revenue stream volatile as a result of that. The state budget suffers chronic shortfalls and public sector wages are frequently delayed as a result. Foreign aid, therefore, remains an essential part of South Sudanese government financing. They are vulnerable. Politically, South Sudan is under targeted US and EU sanctions for corruption and human rights abuses on top of that, and its leadership is eager for a path back into the good graces of Western donors. Israel, with its considerable influence in Washington and Brussels, is in a position to facilitate such a rehabilitation. Security is another lever. The South Sudanese military is factionalised and underfunded. Internal insurgencies and cross-border tensions make it dependent on foreign training, equipment and intelligence support. Israel's got a long history of providing such assistance to African governments, often with fewer conditions attached to them than Western militaries do. Most moral army my foot once again. For a leadership concerned with regime stability, that is no small attraction either. Diplomatically, as the world's newest state, independent only since 2011, South Sudan is still developing its foreign policy infrastructure. It's fewer entrenched alliances and less institutional resistance to transactional arrangements. And finally, the country exists in what might be called a low media density zone. While the humanitarian situation there is dire, South Sudan rarely commands sustained global media attention unless there is a major outbreak of violence. From Israel's perspective, that relative obscurity could make it an ideal location to quietly implement a controversial resettlement scheme away from the scrutiny that a more high-profile host might attract. But I can't see how the mass displacement of the entire people of Gaza to another state would be missed by even the mainstream media. The humanitarian reality on the ground in South Sudan, however, makes a mockery of the claim that such relocation would be protective. The World Food Programme and the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification reported in mid-2025 that 7.7 million South Sudanese, that's around 57% of the population there, were facing severe food insecurity at IPC Phase 3 or worse, with tens of thousands in Phase 5, which is classified as famine or catastrophe. That is basically the same level as Gaza has reached, therefore. Conflict persists in multiple regions, and the United Nations has warned of the risk of a return to full-scale war. Healthcare infrastructure is threadbare outside of a few urban centres. Refugee camps already hosting people fleeing Sudan and elsewhere are overcrowded, underfunded, and prone to disease outbreaks. To move displaced Palestinians into this environment would not meet the standard of a safe third country under international refugee law, to say the very least. It would transfer them from one humanitarian emergency straight into another, compounding their displacement and insecurity rather than alleviating it. The only beneficiary to this plan would be Israel and Trump, who couldn't care less. The legal framework governing such situations leaves very little room for manoeuvre here. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention is clear and categorical in its prohibition on forceful transfers and deportations of protected people from an occupying territory. Or an occupied territory even. The International Criminal Court's Rome Statute in Article 7.1d defines deportation or forcible transfer as a crime against humanity when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population. The elements of crimes adopted by the ICC clarify that forcibly covers not only physical force, but also threats, coercion, and the creation of a coercive environment. In other words, if civilians have no real choice but to leave because of siege conditions or famine or credible fear of violence, the transfer is considered forcible even if nominal consent has been given, which you can imagine they could be pressured into doing. This interpretation has been reinforced in jurisprudence from the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, notably in the Kirstic case concerning Srebrenica, where the forced removal of women, children and elderly persons was held to constitute forcible transfer despite the absence of overt violence in the act of removal. The International Law Commission's articles on state responsibility add yet another layer of potential liability. Article 16 of that provides that a state which aids or assists another in committing an internationally wrongful act is internationally responsible if it does so with knowledge of the circumstances and if the act would be wrongful for it to commit itself. Applied here, that means South Sudan could be held internationally responsible if it knowingly facilitates the deportation of Gaza under coercive conditions, regardless of whether its own forces are directly involved in that transfer or not. So these legal obligations are very, very clear. The International Court of Justice has already ordered Israel, in the ongoing genocide case brought by South Africa, to take all measures within its power to prevent acts prohibited under the Genocide Convention and to ensure that humanitarian conditions in Gaza are improved, not degraded. Not that they have taken any notice of that at all, as we know. A reckoning must await them for that. The ICJ's earlier advisory opinion on the wall in the occupied Palestinian territory made clear that measures creating irreversible demographic changes in occupied territory are unlawful. So a relocation of Gaza to South Sudan, especially one engineered under siege conditions, would move in the opposite direction from what the court has demanded utterly. To fully understand the implications of the Israel-South Sudan reports, it's useful to place them in the context of similar arrangements that have been attempted elsewhere. Israel's own history offers a close parallel, that third country deal they attempted with Rwanda and Uganda, as I mentioned a moment ago, under which Eritrean and Sudanese asylum seekers were to be flown out in exchange for cash and other inducements. Both Rwanda and Uganda denied the deals publicly, and in the end, Israel's High Court blocked further removals amid legal challenges. Here in the UK, the plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda, of course, for offshore processing was ruled unlawful by the Supreme Court, and then finally scrapped by the incoming Labour government after hundreds of millions of pounds have been wasted by the Tories. The European Union and Italy's funding of the Libyan Coast Guard to intercept and return migrants to detention centres where abuse is endemic has drawn sustained condemnation from the United Nations and human rights groups. Australia's payments to Cambodia to take refugees from its offshore detention centres yielded only a handful of relocations, most of which failed when the transferees moved on soon after arrival. So the pattern in each case is consistent. The initiating state targets a partner that is aid-dependent or politically isolated, offers a package of incentives, frames the deal in humanitarian terms, and then faces legal and reputational blowback when the underlying coercion becomes clear. Seen through this lens, South Sudan's public denial looks less like categorical rejection and more like a holding position. The government knows the risks, legal, diplomatic, domestic, of being perceived as complicit in the forced displacement of Palestinians. It also knows the potential gains: financial aid, security assistance, diplomatic cover, sanctions getting lifted, and infrastructure projects. Strategic denial allows it to keep negotiating space open without committing itself in the court of public opinion. Ethically and politically, the stakes could hardly be higher, though. Relocating Palestinians from Gaza to South Sudan would not protect them. It would entrench their displacement and undermine their internationally recognised right to return to their homes. It would normalise the use of population removal as a tool of conflict management, sending a dangerous signal that if a state can make life unlivable for a population, it can then just export them to another country under the guise of humanitarianism. It would shift the burden of care to one of the world's most fragile states, already struggling to meet the needs of its own people. Most fundamentally, it would provide political cover for Israel's strategic aim of reshaping Gaza's demographic reality in a way that makes the restoration of Palestinian sovereignty even harder. The phrase voluntary migration cannot withstand serious scrutiny in this context. It's a joke. In a territory where the civilian population is under siege, facing bombardment and famine, the choice to leave is not a choice at all. It is, in the words of international law, a coerced decision made in the absence of viable alternatives. That makes it forcible transfer. That makes it ethnic cleansing, no matter how it is dressed up in diplomatic language. The evidence, the precedent, and the law point to only one conclusion. This is not about protecting civilians. It is about clearing territory, as if there is any doubt in our minds about that anyway, even if I hadn't already explained the whys and wherefores of this plan. Relocating Gazans to South Sudan would deepen their displacement, undermine their right to return, and outsource their suffering to one of the most fragile states in the world. Yet the full story is still not over. If the plan proceeds, it could lock in a permanent demographic change in Gaza and test the willingness of the international community to enforce its own laws. If it dies in denial, it will still stand as proof that forced displacement is no longer unthinkable in polite diplomatic company. What comes next, whether through quiet implementation or public collapse, could determine not just Gaza's fate, but whether forced transfer becomes a normalised tool of 21st century conflict. And it'll be another nail in the coffin of the UN and those international legal frameworks I've aforementioned, which they supposedly defend. Egypt's warnings to South Sudan are, however, pretty laughable given their own conduct and the fact they've just signed a $35 billion gas deal with the genocidal blue and white state, which just proves what a bunch of hypocrites the Sisi regime is with regards to dealing with Israel. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already. so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.